Morning and happy birthday, Velocity. Hey, we are so glad that you're here. But what we want to do actually for this birthday, because it's year 5, we wanted to take a few minutes and we wanted to tell you how this whole thing got started. Back in 2002, I went to work at a church in Canal Fulton called High Point Christian Church. It was a great church, loved that church, still love that church to this day. And I was hired there as the student minister. And when Vanessa and I first went to start helping and doing student ministries, it was a pretty small congregation of about 150 people. And so we just went in, we worked really, really hard, and we reached out to a ton of non-believing students. And for whatever reason, over the next 5 years, God just allowed us to catch lightning in a bottle. And that church just exploded with growth. It got really, really big, really, really fast. Our student ministries went from 8 students to over 100 in just a few years. And it was so crazy, like just fun and excitement and activity all the time. We named our student ministry The Storm. It was the name of our youth group there at High Point. And the reason that we called it The Storm was because there's this parable in the Bible about Jesus. One time he got into a boat and was crossing a lake with his disciples. And when they crossed this lake, this huge storm just came ripping across this water. And the disciples were afraid, and they're like, "Lord, we're going to drown." And the Bible says that Jesus stood up and he said to the waters, he said, "Peace, be still." And the storm just calmed down. And the disciples looked at each other and they were like, "Who is this person that even the wind and the waves obey what he has to say?" And the scripture says that they believed that he really was God's son because of what happened at the storm. And our goal for this youth ministry was that teenagers and children all across that area of Ohio would really believe that Jesus was God's son through this youth ministry called The Storm.
I'm Jason Kettler. I'm 24 years old. I was part of Scott's group back in the day called The Storm since I was in 6th grade, since the beginning. Loved every single minute of it, learned so much from him, and it was just our second family here at High Point. It was just amazing. Every Sunday coming, and even outside Sundays, Scott would call us, "Hey, you want to go get some lunch?" And it was just amazing.
I said to Scott, I said, I would really, whatever it is, I would really like to help you any way I can. And at that particular time, Scott said, "Well, the biggest thing right now is there is no such thing here at the church as a youth budget. And we could really use some money, financial help." And my reply was, "You have it." And I did that for about a year. And like I said, we're still meeting on a regular basis on Mondays. And I finally come to his office one day and I asked him, I said, "What can I do, Scott, I'd like to be more involved?" He said, "Well, I don't really need your money anymore because the elders have given me a budget." And he said, "I need you."
Well, the storm got so big over a few years that the church decided to put up a multi-purpose building. And we raised a ton of money to build this huge building right there in Canal Fulton. It was this huge activity center. And it cost about $1.2 million. It was just amazing. And right as we were breaking ground for this new building, something very peculiar happened. In April of 2007, I got a phone call from a man that I had never met. And he said, "Scott, we've been praying about people who would be willing to move to Cleveland to start a church. And your name came up. Would you be willing to talk with us?" And I was like, "Cleveland, Ohio?" And he's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "No, I'm not interested at all in moving to Cleveland, Ohio." I said, I love the Browns, but they never win. The weather's colder there than it is here. And I just wasn't interested at all. I said, "I'm not interested." I said, "I'll tell you what." I said, "There's 3 people I think that you should call." And I gave that man those names. And then we hung up the phone. Well, the very next week, I got another phone call from another man that I had never met. And he said, "Hey, Scott, we've been praying about somebody who'd be willing to move to Cleveland to start a church, and your name came up. Would you be willing to talk with us?" And I told them, I said, "Did you talk with this other person?" And he's like, "No, we haven't talked with anybody else." And I'm like, "Well, I just got a phone call about this last week, so I'm going to tell you what I told them. I am not interested in planning a church at all." I said, "But there's 3 people I think you should talk to," and I gave him those names, and then I hung up. Well, the very next week, a friend of mine, his name is Dan Smith, who started Momentum Christian Church down in Valley View, he called me on the phone. He's like, "Hey, Scott, we've been praying about somebody who'd be willing to move to Cleveland and start a church, and your name came up. Would you be willing to talk to us?" And I'm like, no, I'm not interested in moving to Cleveland to start a church. I said, this is like the third phone call I got about this. And then I was like, yeah, this is the third phone call I got about this. And it was like, wait a minute. And I started to wonder, like, God, are you saying something to me? But I told Dan, I said, you know what? I said, I'm not interested. I said, but I'll pray about it, which I had no intention of doing. So I went home that night and I told Vanessa, walked in the door and picked Maddie up, gave her a hug. And I said, hey, honey, I said, what would you think about moving to Cleveland to start a church?
Well, when Scott came home and said it to me, it was very strange. You know, he said, what would you think about moving to Cleveland to start a church? And the funny thing was, there had been other things in our life where Scott had said, you know, what would you think about moving to, you know, Kentucky or something like that? And my immediate reaction was no, absolutely not. I have no peace about that. I have no desire to do that. But when he said move to Cleveland to plant a church, I said, well, I don't know. So my initial reaction wasn't no, but it definitely wasn't yes. And then as I started to consider moving to Cleveland, I thought of all the things that we were involved in at the church that we were at. I thought of the youth ministry kids who were just getting ready to start their senior year of high school that we started with as sixth graders. I started thinking about the women's ministry that we were just getting ready to launch that fall. I thought about a lot of different things. So logically for me, I just thought, you must be mistaken. God can't be calling us to do that right now because there's too much other stuff that we have going on right now. So while it sounds like intriguing, there's just no way that that's what God's actually telling you to do right now.
Well, a few weeks after these phone calls, Vanessa and I went to a high school graduation, Northwest High School. We went to this high school graduation with two of our friends whose names were Dennis and Trish Patton. And the reason we went with them is because they had a boy whose name was Jeff, who was in my youth group, and Jeff died his senior year of high school. And so we knew that Jeff's graduation day was going to be really, really difficult for them. So we decided to go to the high school graduation to sit with Trish and Dennis. And while we were sitting at this high school graduation, this wasn't a Christian school, this was a public school, this huge high school choir stands up, they go up on stage, and the first song that they sang was Here Am I, Send Me, which was this passage from the book of Isaiah. And so as they were singing the song, I leaned over into Vanessa, to my wife, and I said, Vanessa, do you hear what they're singing? And she's like, Scott, I don't care what they're singing. You know, I'm like, I know, me either. I totally agree with you. This whole Cleveland thing, like, let's just forget about it. Well, the very next week, Vanessa and I took all of our high school seniors. We had a bunch of high school seniors from the Storm, and we took them every year down to Virginia Beach Camp. Now, I had made the reservations for Virginia Beach Camp in January. It was now June, and we were going to pack up and drive all night to go to Virginia Beach Camp and get all these hotels and stuff. It's a lot of fun for high school seniors. So we get into the vans, we drive all night to the Atlantic Sands Hotel, and when we get to the Atlantic Sands Hotel, we walk into the lobby, and I told the lady, I said, hey, I'm Scott Pugh, I'm from the Storm. I said, we have a big block of rooms here. And the lady's like, oh, I'm sorry, your rooms won't be ready till at least noon. It was like 8 o'clock in the morning. She's like, they won't be ready till at least noon, so you'll have to do something else. I said, well, I have 40 high school seniors outside in 15 passenger vans, and if you don't find us a place to put our luggage and a place that we can change, I'm going to let all of them loose in your hotel. And amazingly, she got on her computer and she was able to find us a place to put our luggage and get these students changed so they could get out to the beach. Well, as we were waiting in the lobby for our keys, me and one of the boys from my youth group, whose name is Jay Kettler, we were standing in the lobby, and as I looked across the lobby, there was this big, tall African-American guy.
Hey, Jay, I'll bet you $5 that man standing in the corner over there by himself is a preacher. I'm like, I'll take that bet. I'll take that bet in a heartbeat.
So as I'm standing in the lobby and make this bet with Jason, I walk over to this guy, and I'm like, hi. He's like, hi, I'm Scott Pugh. And he goes, hi, my name's Isaiah. And I'm like, what's your name? He said, my name's Isaiah. I'm like, whatever. I said, can I ask you a question? He's like, sure. I said, are you a preacher? He's like, yeah, I'm a preacher. I said, well, why are you here at the Atlantic Sands Hotel on a Sunday morning all dressed up? Like, why aren't you at your church? He said, actually, we're starting a church here today in the Atlantic Room. Do you go to church? You should come. And when he said that, I started thinking, there are 1 million hotels in Virginia Beach. What are the chances that I make a reservation in January on the very same day that this church is going to be starting in this hotel on a Sunday, like of all the things. So I just knew like God was saying something to me. So after he said this, I came back over to Jay and we talked for a minute.
And you come back with this huge smile. I'm like, he's like, and you were like, Jay, he is a preacher. And I'm like, you're kidding me. Well, now where am I going to get the $5? That's what I was thinking.
And then I walked outside to talk to Vanessa. And when I walked outside to tell Vanessa, I'm like, honey, you're not going to believe this. I said, there's a guy inside. I said, they're starting a church here today in the Atlantic room of this hotel. And Vanessa just broke down crying. And the funny thing is, like, when Vanessa cries, like, it's not good. Like, all the kids are like, what's wrong with Vanessa? Scott, did you say something to her? I'm like, no, she's happy. She always cries when she gets to the beach. Like, don't be sad. So when we got back from Virginia Beach, we started to realize, like, man, maybe God is really telling us something. Maybe we're supposed to pay attention to this. So what I would do is every Friday, I would get in my car and I would drive to Cleveland, and I would meet with every mayor, every police chief, every city official, anybody who would give me the time of day, and I would ask them this question. I would say, what is the biggest need in this area of Cleveland? And I heard people say, like, well, you know, we're here at the city, we're really committed to stamping out styrofoam, or we want to green the waterfront, or we want to do whatever. And every Friday, I would just drive home knowing, like, God, you're not calling me to plant a church. There's no way. I mean, I'm not going to spend my life stamping out styrofoam or greening the waterfront. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those things, but I'm just not wired that way. Well, a few months after that, I called the city of South Euclid, and I asked to set up a meeting with Mayor Georgine Wheelow. And I came to this meeting with very little expectation, but I walk in and I sit down and we started talking, and she talked with me for over an hour. And she told me all about the city and the history of the city. And before we left, she said, Scott, is there anything I can do for you? I said, yes, actually there is. I said, can you tell me what the biggest need in this part of Cleveland is? And she said, yes. She said, the biggest need is we need somebody who'd be willing to come here and do something for the children of our city, because there's not a lot of stuff going on. And she looked at me and she goes, Scott, if you're going to move to Cleveland to plant a church, please come to South Euclid and please do something for our children. Now, anybody who knows me, they know two things. Number one, I just love people who are far from God, because I was somebody who was far from God as well. But the second thing that people know about me is I love children. Like, I wish, like, if Vanessa could give birth to two-year-old children, we'd have like 1,000 kids, you know. But I just love children. Now, when Georgine said that to me, when she said, please come to South Euclid and please do something for our children, it was like, I can't believe she just said that to me. And we talked for a few more minutes, and I got up and I walked towards my car, and as I was walking to my car, I was just like, why did she say that? Why did she say that to me? Of all the things in the world that she could have said, why did she bring up children? And when I drove home that day, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that God was telling Vanessa and I to move to Cleveland and to start a church that would do two things. To be a church that would really, really reach people who were far from God, and we really wanted to be a church that made children matter. Well, a few weeks after my meeting with Georgine, I went back and I told the elders of our church at High Point, I said, listen, I really feel like God is telling us to move to Cleveland, and I didn't understand why. I mean, we just put this huge facility up for all the children at High Point Christian Church and for all the kids in the city. It was just this amazing building, and it was so hard to leave because of this facility that we put up, because there was so much opportunity that we could do with that building. But I told him, I said, listen, I don't understand why, but I feel like God is telling us to move to Cleveland. And after I told the elders, I told some of our friends, I got some of my best friends at that church together, and I told them, including the students in my youth ministry, I told them, I said, listen, Vanessa and I are leaving, and here's why we feel we need to go.
I remember one of the nights we all gathered in the hotel room and just had a lesson. And we just all sit there and just talk about what we have learned in the past from the storm. We knew something was coming that you were going to say. We all did, because we felt that. And that's a couple days into the vacation, you were like, that's when you and Vanessa told us that you were going to move to make a new church in Cleveland.
Well, after Vanessa and I left High Point, I knew that what we were getting ready to do was going to be really different, because the churches that I had worked at before, they had buildings, they had sound systems, they had budgets, they had Bibles. We were going to a place where there was no building, no budget, no Bibles, there wasn't even any people. I mean, it was me, Vanessa, my 4-year-old daughter, and my 2-year-old son, and all we had was this hope that God was going to do something great through us. So one of the first things that I did was I started recruiting some people to come and help me. One of the first people that we recruited was actually a guy whose name is David Thorne.
So I was right here at this Starbucks. I met with Scott, and I think I was a little overzealous at the time because I brought a 30-page binder describing my personality and what it was going to be like to work with me. I think that freaked Scott out a little bit, but Jess and I, we loved hearing Scott's vision for this church. I went home and Jess and I, we talked about it, prayed about it, thought about it, talked to everyone I knew, journaled about it, did everything possible. In the end, we just decided it was the right choice for us. We were so excited about Velocity and the vision and about being in a church like Velocity. And so we bought a house over on the east side. And man, we have loved being part of Velocity. The last 5.5 years have just been amazing. I love raising my kids at a church like Velocity, and I can't wait for the next 5 years.
One of the first things that we had to do was we had to come up with a name for this church because we didn't know what we were going to name it. The first name that we came up with was Vision Christian Church, and the tagline was helping people see the truth about God's love. And it was like this cool tagline, but we weren't really positive on the name, and the logo we had was like this big scary eyeball. I'm like, that's not going to work. So one day I was sitting at a Panera Bread in Akron and with a friend of mine, his name was Aaron Ray, and Aaron goes, Scott, what do you want this church to do? And I'm like, Aaron, I just want this church to explode like a bullet. I mean, I want it to have so much velocity that it just destroys whatever it hits. And he goes, Velocity. He goes, what about Velocity Christian Church? I'm like, ooh, I like that. So I picked up the phone and I called Dave. I'm like, Dave, what do you think about the name Velocity Christian Church? He's like, that's the name of my small group. And that's how we got the name Velocity. When Vanessa and I made the decision to move to Cleveland, we knew that we were coming to a city where we didn't know anybody. So a friend of mine, Dan Smith from Momentum Church, he asked some of the people from Momentum to leave Momentum and come with us to start Velocity. And two of the first people who agreed to come on board to help us were just the most awesome people in the world. Their names are Lenny and Karen Jermansky.
Karen and I knew right away that was something we wanted to be a part of. And learning that Velocity Church was planned for the South Euclid-Lyndhurst area was even more exciting to us. I got a hold of Dan right away and I said, get me in contact with Scott. Scott and I eventually did make contact, and we met at Legacy Village. And from there, we got in my van and we drove around, and I showed him the whole area. After some time, we started meeting in the living room of Scott and Vanessa's house and had church services on Sundays.
Just a short time later, after we met Lenny and Karen, there were several other people who came on board to agree to be a part of our launch team. That means to agree to come and help us for 6 to 8 months just to help us get this thing off the ground. And there were a lot of people who agreed to help. Dan and Vicki Augustine, Rob and Teresa Polking, John and Kristen Bartles, and a few others agreed to come on board to help us. But we still had a couple holes that we needed to be filled. And one of the big holes that needed to be filled was we wanted to have music on Sunday morning, and Dave Thorne and I cannot sing at all. So one of the things that we decided to do was like, hey, we need to get somebody who could lead worship. So we heard about a guy who was living in Illinois but was originally from Cleveland. His name is Chris Ruprecht. So one day I pick up the phone and I call him and talk to him on the phone, and I said, Chris, my name's Scott Pugh. You don't know me. We've never met. I said, but here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to leave your current ministry where you are in Illinois and move to Cleveland. And what I want you to do is I want you to lead worship at this church plant that now exists of about 12 people. And we want you to come and lead worship. Oh, and by the way, when you move and when you come, we can't pay you anything for at least 2 years. And unbelievably, Chris agreed to come and to be a part of Velocity. So he was with us for a little bit. And then Chris left and went on to PA school. So we had this other gap that we had to fill of finding another worship person. So I had met probably over a 6-month time period, I had met probably 50 or 60 different worship people. And every worship person that I met, I'm like, no. I'm like, no, we don't have piano and organ. No, we're never going to have that. Like, no. We're not going to have a choir. We're not going to do that. And that's nothing wrong with choir. It's just not, it's just not me. So the funny part was we were so frustrated. Finally, I told Dave, I'm like, Dave, just put an ad on Craigslist or put an ad, in some newspaper, and maybe we'll find somebody. Well, unbelievably, we get a response from a Craigslist ad from a guy whose name was Michael Cox.
So in October of 2010, I moved to Cleveland, Ohio from California to be closer to my dad's side of the family. And I was looking for some jobs in ministry, and I really couldn't find anything. And so I was doing some odd jobs like delivering pizzas and just random things. And my sister was like, well, why don't you check Craigslist? I'm like, Craigslist? What kind of church posts ads on Craigslist? So I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I went on Craigslist, and there it was, Velocity Church, looking for a worship leader. And I was like, okay, well, I'll give it a shot. So I sent in my resume and responded. And Scott called me a day later. I was like, hey, man, I really like your resume. I really want to meet with you. Let's meet at Jimmy John's over in Mayfield. I'm like, first of all, I'm from California. I don't even know what a Jimmy John's is. So I'm like, okay, fine. Let's meet at Jimmy John's. So I met at Jimmy John's, and we talked for a little while. And I told him about my background in like youth ministry and worship ministry. And, I really felt a connection with Scott, and when he started talking about his passion for children was really when I was like, I really want to be a part of this church. And he started talking about his mission, about that Velocity wants to ignite your faith, to fuel your life, to impact the world. And I was like, I could really buy into that. And so a couple days later, Scott was like, hey man, I want you to come to Velocity and lead on Sunday, and the rest is history.
Well, when we moved to Cleveland, Dave and I, we made the decision that before we ever had our first public service, that we would do no less than 18 service events for the city before we ever had our public service. Before we ever had people come in and sing and clap and listen to word and preaching and the Bible and all that stuff. Because we wanted to set the DNA that Velocity is a church that serves. We're not superstars, we're servants. And that's one of the things. So Dave and I came, and every month it was legitimately Dave and I and any volunteers that we could recruit. Dave and I would just go out and we would serve, rake leaves, we'd shovel snow. I mean, we would do all these crazy things just to let people know, like, hey, there's a church that's coming to South Euclid Lyndhurst, and they're going to be a church that truly cares about children and about the city and about serving. So Dave and I did all these events. Now, we had planned on having our worship service either at Brush High School there in Lyndhurst, and we also had another contract at Richmond Stadium 20. And I thought either of those locations would have been fine, but one day I was driving down the road. I live right there on Ford. I was driving down Ridgebury, and I looked to my left, and I saw this big, huge building, and I'm like, I wonder what that building is. It looks like a school. So I made a left on Richmond, a left on Neal, a left on Alve, and I parked, and I came inside, and I met a guy whose name was Ryan Kellogg. And when I met him, I said, Ryan, do you know who owns this building? He goes, yeah. He goes, my dad does. I go, oh, that's awesome. I said, do you think your dad would be interested in talking with me? Do you think that I could ask him if we could rent this building to have services for a church on Sunday?
Hi, my name is Scott Kellogg, and these are two of my grandkids, Olivia and Sammy. They're here as cuteness props, and I'm here to tell the story of how Velocity began. It was 2008 that Faith and I bought the school building, and about a year after that, a man was knocking on our door. His name is Scott Pugh, and he ended up meeting with my son, Ryan Kellogg, who was the building supervisor at the time. And he spoke to Ryan about the possibility of hosting a church here on Sundays. And Ryan, who was at that time in a worship band and very much active in ministry as our family was, we were thrilled to think that this building might be used to spread God's word and his love. And so Scott Pugh called me, and we sat down and talked, and It was 5 years ago to this day that the first church service at Velocity started. It was shortly after that, about a year and a half, that our family felt a pull to leave the church we were at to come to Velocity. So Faith and I, our 4 kids, their spouses, their grandkids, all came to Velocity, and we have been greatly blessed ever since.
So a lot of the pieces of the puzzle were coming together for us. We had a worship leader, we had a few people on a worship team, we had about 14 or 15 individuals who had agreed to be a part of our launch team. And but there was a couple of things needed to be done. So Scott Justin came in and ran all the lights and the sound that we have here at Velocity. He worked sometimes till 2 and 3 in the morning rigging up all these lights and doing all the stuff. He's just so amazing. He donated so much time when we first got started and still does this day. He's just great. Kyle Fenner, Jason McGlynn agreed to play bass. So we had all these people who just came together. And on April 5th, 2009, we had our very first worship service here at Velocity. And we had no idea who was going to come. The night before the service, I asked Vanessa, I'm like, honey, I know that you and me are going to be here, and I know that our launch team is going to be there, but do you think anybody else is going to show up at this elementary school building on Alvey Road? Do you think that anybody is going to show up? Well, on April 5th, 2009, we had our first service, and there were just so many people who were kind of far from God who showed up.